Good evening, everyone. It is so good to see you again. And for some of you for the first time, having the crowd in Stover is wonderful. And I'm really glad that you guys are able to be there. It's enjoyable to have everybody present, people kind of popping in, popping out. We're in part 3 of a look at the U.S. Civil War. And what we've done for the first 2 weeks is kind of lay the foundation. Now, when people talk about the study of the Civil War, they will usually start where we will be tonight. We should get into the middle of the 1850s. The period from the Mexican War, which some of you may remember we studied together last year in Stover, the period of the Mexican War, which ends in 1848, all the way through Lincoln's election in 1860, is often known as the road to war. And when we looked at the American Revolution a year and a half ago, I pointed out to you, and I told you even in January when we studied this year, looking at the great pattern history, that there's always kind of some similar markers that kind of make your way through in the last, generally it's maybe a decade or so, leading up into the explosion of whatever the great crisis is. So when people say, hey, we're going to do a study on the Civil War, they'll usually spend time in this period. If you remember Ken Burns' masterful PBS series, which has video clips and kind of walked all the way through in a 16-hour study of the Civil War, the first 2 hours was on this period here. We're going to probably take it in two sessions. I still haven't got a final list, but of how I think I'm going to do it as I'm trying to let things kind of roll forward. But I think we'll probably be most of the summer looking at this. I could see us going all the way into August, trying not to get too deep into the weeds, and at the same time not just skirting past, sort of like, hey, there was this, and move on for 2 years. So we did the first 2 weeks, and let me start to just kind of back us into this, was we kind of covered what led to the Civil War. Actually, with my American history class that we studied, the early part of the American history, I will tell them from day one what the final exam is about. And the final exam is, why was there a Civil War? And as we get closer, what I tell them is there's 2 ways to answer that question. And one is what I call the narrow way, which starts in this 1848, 1850 period. And it's a very appropriate way of looking at the war, but it's narrow, it's thin, it's kind of focused in. The broader way, which is what I want them to deal with and what we've been talking about, is what are the foundational issues that kind of led to this moment? Because if you don't understand the foundational history working into a setting, I believe it's impossible to really begin to grasp, well, why'd that happen? And so we want to know why it happens as well as what happened. And we will be looking as we go along, obviously, as to what happened, but we want to know, well, why did it happen? And so in the first week, we looked at these things here, leading all the way through the fact that as we got closer to the 1830s and 40s, there was this growing sense of division. And this was the very thing that James Madison was afraid of. Of all the things that he worried about and thought about in setting up the Constitution. Remember, James Madison is considered the father of the Constitution, although he certainly was standing on the shoulders of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and working in partnership with many other people like Alexander Hamilton. His fear was the potential of a country this size over the continent would struggle and break apart into smaller pieces. Now, he reasoned that that could be avoided as long as there were enough differences throughout. So rural versus urban. Well, there's rural parts of New York as well as New York City. There's rural parts of New Jersey. There's urban parts of Louisiana and New Orleans. There'd be rich and poor and different types of work, different types of religion. And as long as there were enough of those differences, it would form like a spider web. But he reasoned, if something ever happened to draw one part of the continent into a section all by itself, well, that'd be bad. And we can really see from the moment the country is founded, this is a fear that kind of lingers over things, and it all will explode coming out of the Second Great Awakening, which provides for us in the abolition movement and Manifest Destiny, the 2 twin engines that are going to really drive the conflict forward. So we saw out of Manifest Destiny this idea of the Americans spreading over the western half of the continent. And it wove into what was happening in Texas, or in Mexican history, Tejas. And the Tejans, or the Hispanics and the Anglos living in what we call Texas, began to work together in a way that they were frustrated with what the new country of Mexico was doing. Again, we've covered this in our time together. Some of you may remember us looking at the Manifest Destiny through the Mexican War. We went really deep into the Mexican War itself. But this moment with Texas kind of opened up these two issues of Manifest Destiny and abolition, meaning this: when Texas gained its independence, they immediately appealed to the United States and said, hey, we want to hook up. We want to be part of the group. Well, if all you knew as a philosophy in the country at that moment was Manifest Destiny, then this assumption would be, well, this is a slam dunk. Of course, we're going to take this land. I mean, it's large, about as large as the old South. We'll bring it all in. However, at this moment, alongside Manifest Destiny, was this coming of the new abolition movement. And for the abolition leaders, this was not going to be something that could be accepted, because they reasoned the war that involved Texas would involve slavery. Now, they weren't just making this up. The leader, or one of the key leaders from the South, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, and we saw this last week as a reminder, became Secretary of State at about this time in 43, 44. And so he writes a letter to the English secretary in charge of, diplomacy, and a man named Pakenham. And in this letter, Calhoun does something that no leader from the South had ever done. And that is that he puts clearly on the table the idea that slavery is a positive good for the country. And that, yes, we will take Texas. He kind of threatens England, and they should stay out of it, because we, the United States, need Texas to be added for slavery. Now, he's thinking along lines of the fact that the Missouri Compromise had blocked off the northern part of the Louisiana Territory to the growth of slavery, which by this point in the 1840s, the Southerners realized they kind of got ripped off. They didn't get half the land. But in their minds, we're not arguing the point. We accept this compromise. Let's move on. But then when they look at the map and they realize Texas, as it's now called, is below that line, well, then okay, cool. This will be land for us. So he kind of brings this up. And so as we find ourselves last week, where we were leaving ourselves was going right into the 1844 election, which I would say is in the top 5 of most important elections. It's not one that everybody thinks about in its importance, but we'll see not only was it critical for the causing of the war, it's critical for getting Texas, which is usually considered a positive, but also it was critical for taking this main step to getting us into the Civil War, which is where we're kind of headed. So in 1840, remember, William Henry Harrison was elected president, but he died soon after the inauguration. He got a cold, gave the speech in the rain, didn't work out. It was actually our first time of a president dying in office. And there wasn't really any precedent what to do. It wasn't really clear what the Constitution meant when it said the vice president would sort of take over. Did that mean he took over and just became the president? Did he take over until there was a makeup election? Did he take over and act in the dead president's name? It wasn't clear. But Tyler just took the reins and ran with it, which made him very few friends. And so there was no support for him staying in the office. The two political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, had two giants ready to bring forward. Martin Van Buren was the former president. Remember, he had been the vice president and the right-hand man for Andrew Jackson. And then he becomes the president in 1836, but he loses in 40. Well, he wants to be the president still, and would have been at that point the first president, or the only president at that moment, to win non-consecutive terms. Henry Clay was back for his third round. Clay and Van Buren was amongst that young guard that we noted that had come into the system, really our second wave of leaders out of the War of 1812. And so now he's towards the end of his life. He's actually only got a few years left to live, maybe 5 or 6. And as he's making that journey, he wants to go one more time. He thinks he's due. You may remember how long we talked about in our study of Andrew Jackson, how Clay was a critical figure at that moment. And so in Clay's mind, he always was right on the cusp of being the president, but was held out by other factors. Well, of course, today, TV is what we're maybe more comfortable with, but the young kids these days, they use social media, they use Twitter, they use Instagram. President Obama was famous for really beginning the first kind of idea of a president using Twitter and social media. Clearly, President Trump has jumped on that bandwagon and used it. So we get things from the candidates all the time. I mean, I can barely scroll through my feed on Facebook without seeing something from Mr. Biden or President Trump in my email. But back then, you didn't really hear much, which actually might be a good thing today, but you didn't hear as much. And so what would happen is these candidates would get letters, sometimes letters from newspapers, so editors would write them and basically test them out and say, hey, what do you think about this issue? And there was no bigger issue than Texas. So in a space of about 3 weeks, both Clay and Van Buren wrote a response letter to different newspapers about the issue of Texas. And by answering the questions, you obviously are putting your position out, which for both men would be detrimental to their overall journey. Again, we've covered this. So if you were with us when we did the Manifest Destiny Mexico War period, you'll go, oh, I remember these things. So I'm going to be briefer than then, but just kind of make sure I don't lose anybody else. Clay and the Whigs are like no on annexation. Their reasoning, which was correct, was that it would take us to war, and we should not want to go to war with Mexico. Maybe there's some negotiation. Maybe Clay is suggesting when I'm president, I'll be able to work out a relationship with the Mexican leaders. We'll work things out. But we're not going to just immediately annex Texas. But he doesn't really say much about slavery at all. In fact, he's kind of tepid about slavery, and there's people who are not really sure what his position is. Van Buren also rejects annexation, but this is more tricky because the Democrats are in the South, as we just saw, pro-annexation. And again, this is one of these moments where we can see what's happening when we say sectionalism. Up to this point, both parties we would call national parties, meaning there were Southern and Northern Whigs, and there were Southern and Northern, Democrats. But now, instead, there's a growing sense, particularly amongst the Democrats, but also amongst the Whigs, of a Southern focus first, or a Northern focus, or a non-Southern focus is the way it works out. So Van Buren rejecting annexation really weakens his position moving into the nomination process. So he, of course, is saying, hey, look, we also can do more negotiations, but we don't need to do them now. Both of these things are going to cost both men. For Van Buren, it's going to cost him the nomination. For Clay, it's going to cost him support with abolition voters. So again, remind yourself, with the new abolition movement, they had 3 different avenues of attack. One was activism with the Underground Railroad. One was writing. So men like Frederick Douglass and William Still are writing newspapers and books. And then one was political, and they'd created the Liberty Party. And so the Liberty Party was gaining momentum between the 32, 36 elections and all the other elections, city-state elections that were going on. And so in that process, they're becoming a force in the North, in New England, in New York, and Pennsylvania. And Clay's going to need them, and he won't get them. Van Buren will find out, to his surprise, that he will lose the nomination, because the Democrats will take the position of, we will not have a closet abolitionist, somebody who's kind of hedging around. Now, Van Buren never said anything about abolition. He actually is leaning to abolition, but in his writings, he just talked about annexation. But for Southern Democrats, that was too much. So he's going to lose the support, And so into the story, the Democrats reach out to a little known or kind of minor person at this moment, James Polk, another Tennessean. So they're linking him back to Jackson, who, remember, is kind of like the father. Jefferson is the godfather of the Democrat Party, but you've got Polk as kind of Jackson's the father, and Polk was considered like Jackson, was a friend of Jackson. Jackson gave him support. And ultimately in the vote that will happen in the 44 election, Polk's eagerness in annexation, particularly with Texas, will gain him full support in the South, but also gain him support in the North, so that he's able to edge out Clay, who still will have the Whig nomination. Now, if you look at the map here, I'll go back, skip this for a second. It doesn't look that close. I mean, Polk wins 170 to 105. But if you look at the popular vote, which still probably was only about 15 or 20%, there still were a few states that did not use a popular vote at this point, though most did use a popular vote. But when you notice what happens, and you wouldn't know this off this map, but in New York in particular, Clay lost support in a couple of key states. And in New York in particular, there's some political historians who've looked at this and believe that it was so narrow of a victory for Polk over Clay that had Clay gained the support of the abolition voters, he would have won New York. So as you can see here on my little chart, New York was 36 votes. So if you add 36 to Clay and subtract 36 from Polk, all of a sudden Clay's the winner, 141 to 134. So that ambiguity on his part cost him, again, for Van Buren, him perhaps being too bold, cost him the nomination. And what this means, obviously, is that Tyler is eager to take the reins and take off, and Tyler and Polk will work together. I mean, Polk's the one who's getting elected. Tyler actually wants to kind of make his mark. He kind of feels a little picked on, and so he and Polk will kind of work together to force through resolutions of annexation, not an actual treaty of annexation. That had been defeated before by the abolitionists. And so it was interesting because I only mention this is a little in the weeds, but I only mention this because this will be, for the Northern Democrats, more evidence of how the South is beginning to operate independently of the country. And so when the break comes in 1860, there will be several Democrats who will support Lincoln in the Civil War, throughout the entire Civil War. And a lot of that support for Lincoln goes back to this moment, because they perceived that the new president, Polk, but Polk and Tyler had harmed and kind of taken advantage of Van Buren. All right? Now, at the same time, when Polk becomes the president, he's got 4 goals he's going to shoot for. He wants to work them off really quickly. 2 are involving finances, which he is able to do. The other involves Oregon, which was that map I just showed you. We're going to come back to in just a second. And then 4th was not so much attacking Mexico per se, but it was buying California. Let me go back to this map just for a second. What he reasoned with buying California was really buying all of this. But if he couldn't buy all of this, if he bought the West Coast portion, which would be bigger than the state of California currently, Mexico, he reasoned, could not hold on to this period. You may know, we didn't talk about it in this series, but with Manifest Destiny, there's already now a large contingent of Americans living right here near a Great Salt Lake, which you probably know is where the Mormons ended up. So there's a sense in which this will come into our hands anyway if we can get California. Well, the Mexican government's not having any of that, and they're not interested in negotiating to sell California. So Polk then's really only option is to figure out, is there a way to force the war? So he's going to go about trying to make that happen. And the way he was going to do it was by tricking Mexico into hitting first. And the way they did that involved this land here. So if you look at the map, this right here is where the Nueces River, that's how I pronounce it, and the Rio Grande down here. Now, if you look on this other map, you can see how this dotted line represents the Rio Grande, and what is known as the larger boundary of Tejas. For poor Mexico, their problem was their parent was Spain, and in all the time that Spain had been in charge, they were not as, say, organized as they should have been. And so throughout New Spain history over the 300 years, there were times when Tejas was basically this small state here. You see how small this is? But then there were other times when it was a larger section all the way over here. And it all came back to, where did you draw the border? Was the border the Rio Grande? Was the border the Nueces? Now, this was a battle that Texas and Mexico had been involved with for nearly a decade as they were negotiating what had happened at the end of the treaty. And now that Texas was annexed to America, to the United States, this became a challenge for Mexico with the United States. So Polk's decision to move troops into this area was provocative, and really he's picking a fight, which is one of the reasons why the Mexican War will be the first war in which there's a very active anti-war movement in the country, because how it's perceived, I would say correctly, how Polk is picking a fight. Now, again, let's take the focus to the Civil War. When you do that, what you can notice is that he's unwilling to pick a fight in the same area. In other words, Polk wants to make the argument that he was only trying to get as much land as possible, manifest destiny. However, when you look at what happened with Oregon, he doesn't do the same thing. So in that process of him not doing the same thing, what we find is that he is doing what we probably would wish he would do, which is negotiate with England. Let's not get into a war. And he works with England, as you can see on the map there, to split it, to split Oregon in half, even though he had run on the campaign of taking all of it, 54-40 or bust. So when he splits it, it's the right thing to do. But for Northerners, this was further evidence of how the South and slave power were in control of the country, because they would have said, well, look, where there was no benefit to slavery, clearly you're choosing to negotiate. But where, back to Calhoun's letter, where there's a benefit for slavery, oh, there you're willing to pick a fight with a weaker country. And that was a thing that really incensed the country into this sense of division, and how this war leads us forward into this sense of the two sides now really becoming more entrenched. They couldn't find a way to negotiate this thing. Polk will get his declaration of war after the Mexican troops attack ours, but what are we fighting for? Well, into the story comes, and here you can see some of the fact that there was opposition to the war. I like the fact that Grant himself made note of his own opposition, and I think Grant's not someone who we would say is an abolitionist by any stretch of the imagination. Neither is Lincoln at that point. As you can see, as a congressman, Lincoln will actually, and he was a congressman in DC at this time, Lincoln will attempt to censor the president, basically. That won't happen, but they will pass a statement saying that the war was unnecessary and even unconstitutional. So when you sometimes have wars, you guys may remember some of the things that have gone on for President Trump and President Obama, and some of the battles on the wars on terror that we've had, of people questioning whether those presidents had done something unconstitutional. That's not a new complaint, that's an old complaint. The anti-war feeling will largely, though, ride on the backs of abolition, Grant notwithstanding. David Wilmot uses this moment to put forth an amendment to a bill designed to pay for the war. And it goes down in history as the Wilmot Proviso. And the amendment to the bill for the payment basically said, in whatever land we conquer, no slavery can happen. Now, of course, this is diametrically opposed to Calhoun's position. So you can, again, see this coming division on the point. And of course, Calhoun and the Southerners were incensed. They reject it. What's interesting is if you read the congressional record at this point, Wilmot Proviso shows how slavery and the battle over slavery in this sectional moment is just bubbling under the surface. Because they'll talk about the war, they'll talk about Polk, and then comes his proviso, and boom, the conversation is all about slavery. What's the president doing? Why are we fighting a war for slavery? You almost can get a sense here of what Lincoln will do in 62 when he passes the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, I'll save all that for then, but the same kind of idea of what are we fighting for and where's the discussion going? And so that's kind of what you can see happening here. Ultimately, the proviso is not passed. The money is passed. The war is fought, and the war takes place. You may remember our conversation from, earlier this year, actually last year, I should say, I'm sorry. And Polk set all the pieces in motion. He had troops up here marching towards Santa Fe. He had troops over here, including the Navy, ready to land and kind of swoop into California. And of course, he already had troops down here. Eventually, he'll add a fourth army, which will come down the coast, land near Santa Cruz, and march to Mexico City. It's not really a fair fight. And while the Mexican army does its best, the United States Army is very successful. And ultimately, in a very quick fashion, will have conquered Mexico. In fact, quicker than some people had assumed would happen, which is going to cause problems as we look to what do we do next? What do we do with all this land? A gentleman named Nicholas Trist, you can see here, was designated to become the lead ambassador. So he's sent down in summer of 47 to get to Mexico. He gets to Mexico at about the same time as Winfield Scott's army gets to Mexico City. So he's with the army when they're getting there. For Trist, he has a really challenging situation because Mexico's government collapses again. And you may remember, again, from our previous discussion, one of the challenges for Mexico at this point in 47, they've been a country for 20, 25 years or so. They've already had about 4 or 5 revolutions and overthrows. So Trist all of a sudden has to spend time basically helping form a new government in order to get them the ability to negotiate the surrender. Well, this pause allowed for a larger discussion happening in Congress, as you can see. Maybe we should take all of Mexico. I mean, you kind of back up and there's a larger conversation here, which we won't get into. You and I know we took the land that's in this yellowish color and we did not take the green land. But there were some conversations of, well, maybe we should take all of California. So maybe draw a line across Baja, maybe take all of it, including Mexico City. Well, if that was what was being discussed, of course, slavery's in the mix, right? So we're doing that to maybe take more slave land. So of course, the Northern Democrats are completely opposed to this. Eventually, it'll not pass or not gain momentum because the Southern Democrats were also opposed to it, Southern Whigs as well. Of course, the Whigs were opposed to it in general. And Polk, on paper, never really says anything. In the end, Trist is able to get the agreement to take all the land you and I know that is now the southwest of the country, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, California, all that is taken. Texas, and their discussions about all this larger land were put to rest. So again, in this moment before the war, when we annexed Texas, we technically only annexed this little part over here, not the larger part that you and I know as Texas today. So this was kind of the dust settles, the war's over, and the question becomes, what do we do? How do we handle it? Of course, 4 years have gone by, so there's another election. And this one's not as controversial, but it shows you the growing rise of the abolition movement because now a second anti-slavery party pops up, this one by the very fun name of Free Soil, the Free Soil Party. So you can tell what they think we should do with the land, that whatever we do has to involve no slavery. And when I say, what do we do with the land? What I'm saying is, what are we going to do with slavery? There wasn't a question of should we keep the land. We did. We actually paid them $15 million. By the way, for the anti-war people, that was evidence that Polk knew the war was unjust. When you fight a war and win, you don't pay them for the land. You just say, hey, we won. We beat you. but because Polk negotiated payment for the anti-war members of the country, they're like, see, told you, this thing was unjust and was not a good move on our part. Makes us look bad in the process. The 1850 election introducing, and you've seen this chart before, so now we have two abolition parties. In the 48 election, both the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party will run, but the Free Soil Party gets more momentum, and so that'll be really the party that takes us into the 50s, and they do so because, guess who their political presidential candidate was? Martin Van Buren. Many people have asked me, why don't third parties do better? And there's a lot of reasons why in our country, both kind of systemically or structurally in our Constitution, but also I would suggest strategically, the groups that make decisions as third parties often don't do the right thing. And one of the things that they do poorly is they'll often run people that you've never heard of. And there is some aspect of name recognition to all political parties. If the Green Party in the year 2020 ran Al Gore, or if Oprah or Bill Gates or one of them ran for a third party, their name recognition would be so strong that that group would do well. And so running Van Buren, you can see here on the map, they got over 10% of the vote. So that was a lot more than the Liberty Party had gotten before. And if you add the Liberty Party's vote in, it's a little closer to 12%. So you can see now this abolition movement is really picking up steam. They've got a really good opportunity for growth to occur politically. And what you cannot see from this map, but all through the upper part of the country, there are Free Soil or Liberty Party candidates winning in cities, in some state legislature houses. Now, what this is also doing is weakening the Whig Party. The Whig Party is party number 2, and we all know, you've watched enough politics to know there's always one party that's a little stronger than the other at any given moment. And so the Whig Party is the one that's in trouble right now. And they're going to struggle because the southern part of the country is going to continue to coalesce into its own section. And in the north, the more politically active people will be drifting over to the abolition movement. All right, so with this election, the former General Taylor, Zachary Taylor, will win the presidency. And right off the bat, the problem or the challenge is the discussion of the land. And this leads us to the Compromise of 1850. Now, the Compromise of 1850 is really, from a domestic point of view, the kickoff to the road to war. The Mexican War sets things up. Wilmot Proviso plays a key role. But with this moment, there were some, and if you read the newspapers and you read some of the congressional speeches of this moment, they'll debate this throughout the summer, into the fall, through the election, and into the end of the year of 1850. And there are some who are saying secession and or civil war is going to happen now. And so there's a real fear. And at this point, now in his very last year of life, Henry Clay will kind of rise to the occasion to play his role one more time. He goes down in our history as the great compromiser. He's this guy who has he's been involved in the country from the very beginning. You may remember that he started the American system, which kind of compromised growth and economic power. He was the principal author of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. He kind of compromises South Carolina's tax issue that led to the nullification crisis in the 1830s. So he's right in there. So he rises to the moment to try to solve the day. And it's an interesting moment also because it's a changing of the guard. All the old guard, Henry Clay, Calhoun, Webster, they will all be involved in the debate of this moment. And the bill will fail. Clay is unsuccessful. And for a moment heading into September, it really did look like potential crisis was going to lead to a war. Now, there are many Civil War historians who have studied this moment, and what they propose is that had the war been fought in 1850, it might have gone a very different direction. because through 1850 to 1860, the North continues to bring in millions of immigrants and its industrial base continues to grow. It's hard to say what would have happened, but the South of 1861, when Bull Run happens in May, is largely the same South that you would have seen in 1850. So perhaps it might have gone a different direction. However, rising to the moment are the young guys. So some of the young leaders step in, and in this case, Stephen Douglas of Illinois really has a moment to shine. And what Douglas does, with Clay's permission, is takes Clay's bill, which was one large package of what he's always done it this way. Douglas takes Clay's bill and breaks it off into pieces. So as you and I look at this, it becomes a little easier for us to see what is done to solve this crisis. And the way I like to express it is in kind of a know that there's always two sides to a compromise, right? Both people or both groups are going to get something. So we can study it in pairs. So there's three pairs, and then there's one kind of underwriting important change that occurs. Now I cheat here a little bit at the beginning because the very first pair involves California and Texas clearly had already been admitted. But when you're looking at where the compromise goes, California is the first piece of the puzzle. Now you may wonder, why does it matter if California? They did not have slavery of any significance in California at this moment. And we'll show you a map in just a second. Think back to the Missouri Compromise and how it used the southern border of Missouri as a line to divide free soil from slavery. Well, if you draw that line all the way across, it bisects California pretty much in half. And so for Southerners, they walked into this conversation saying, we want half California. Well, so what Douglas is able to do is say, we're going to let California, because Californians wanted to be free. So Douglas is like, look, we're going to let California be all free because, hey, look, the South, you get all of Texas. So that's the first compromise, California and Texas. The next compromise is really esoteric, but it's just important to put on there. Texas had debts from being its own country. And so the government said, we will take on all of your debts. It's very similar to what Alexander Hamilton did with his assumption bill back in 1790. And so we'll take all your debts, but in exchange for that, you got to be smaller. Again, for the South, they're getting the economic benefit of Texas being economically stable, but they're going to lose some land. And here's a map. You can see that. Again, we showed you before. See, all this yellow is where the old boundary for Tejas went. And it's just part of this, like, why does it go way up there? Is because that's where the Rio Grande goes. And that's just the way it worked out. And then this straight line here, and then this straight line here came from compromises that Spain and the United States made in 1820. So that's kind of why there's this weird kind of piece of it. The Rio Grande goes up this far, and then that's just kind of the way it draws on the map. So what we said to Texas was, you don't get all this land. We're going to make it this kind of shape like this. And by doing that, that made Texas the size that you and I know it today. Part three, right? This may be the most controversial thing, was that the South was demanding a new, stronger Fugitive Slave Act. Now, the idea of capturing fugitives of any kind who escaped slavery of any kind was in the Constitution. But clearly, from the time of our country's constitutional founding, the only slavery that really existed was slavery in the South on the plantations. And so Southern plantation leaders had seen that idea of fugitive slave capturing as a mechanism to help them. But as we noted, over the past decade and a half, the Underground Railroad was being very active and was gaining momentum and was clearly taking, hundreds of slaves every year, aiding hundreds of slaves in escaping. For the South, this was a revenue drain. This is a loss on their ledger column. And we have to stop this. So they demanded it. So they're going to get it. What's the North going to get? The free side. Well, what Congress decides to do to balance was to abolish the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Now, that may not be all that big of a deal to you and me, but remind yourself where DC is. And in this moment, in 1850, Virginia is not considered the North. It's not even considered the middle, right? It's Southern. And so, of course, that was where Jefferson wanted the capital. He wanted it being right off Virginia as kind of an extension of kind of the power and the leadership of Virginia in creating the country. So he wanted it there. By abolishing the slave trade in DC, which is surrounded on all sides by slave states, Virginia and Maryland, it was kind of a metaphorical and philosophical statement that the country was making about slavery. Now remember, we had abolished the external slave trade in the early 1800s, 1809. But the internal slave trade still existed. Remember, it was another revenue stream for the big plantation owners who would sell off slaves, away from them to make a little extra money. By abolishing it in DC, you're really making a statement. It'd be as if we wanted to make a statement of, say, getting rid of the internet, some kind of abolishment in Seattle, right, where we know that, or Silicon Valley, right, in Northern California, right, that somehow would be like, if it happened there first, right, that would be like, whoa, wow, this is really serious. Maybe we are going to somehow do something to the internet. So by doing the slave trade in DC, it was a really big deal at that moment to kind of show the story. Last piece is not a pairing. It really is a pairing, but the easiest way to say it is the phrase that was used was the phrase of popular sovereignty. Now, what popular sovereignty meant in a short version was, hey, we'll just let democracy have its way, which you may think, hey, why would we not do that? But you have to remind yourself, we don't live in a democracy. We live in a republic. And in a republic, the will of the people is not first in line in making decisions. The founders would have freaked out if they thought that you and I in 2020 would believe that democracy or the people voting and deciding on things was the way we would handle it. They just would be very unhappy. That's a whole nother conversation, but I just want you to understand, this was very provocative. Now, we had seen, when we studied Jackson, we had seen that there was this coming movement of the ideas of democracy. It had been really born under Jefferson as the president, although later he repudiated that and realized he had made a mistake because he often complained that people didn't know what they were doing, to which Madison and Adams and Washington, had they been alive, would have all been like, yes, exactly. That's why we don't want to have a democracy. The people often do not know what they're doing. Not that they're stupid, they're just easily misled and usually ill-informed. So the founders set up a country that said, no, let's let specific leaders who can study the issue make the decision. Well, you don't have to like that and believe, obviously what you want to believe is totally fine. But for the founders, that was their deal. By bringing in the idea that in this land that we've conquered, we'll just let popular sovereignty, the people living in that land, kind of vote on things, was shocking. It was also very controversial because of what it meant to the Missouri Compromise. So here's that map I told you about. And again, if you just draw this map line out here, you can see it pretty much would go right there and slice California in half. So again, back to California for a moment. To the south, that should all be slave, and the north is where it should all be free, right over here. So having lost that battle, because they got Texas, Southerners were still of the mindset, well, of course we're going to extend this line so that the bottom half of where you saw the stripes, the bottom half of that land, bottom half of the line, slave, top half free. Well, by choosing popular sovereignty, Congress is basically rejecting the Missouri Compromise. And Southerners were incensed. Because again, by this point, they realized we got ripped off. If this was the old Louisiana Territory land, we didn't get our fair share. And so now we should at least get our fair share of this. and we've already given up California, so that's not fair. Well, they're going to lose the battle, but it's going to set in motion some things, as we're about to see in a second, that will really blow up when we get up here to the middle part. It's also an interesting point, and again, I just point these things out so that we can understand, as much as we may think our current Congress is maybe not doing their job, maybe it's just us as humans, I don't know. But what Congress is doing right here is punting. They're just saying, we don't want to get into this. And by saying popular sovereignty, in their minds, nobody's going to move here for maybe 100 years. Now, they were wrong. And by the end of the century, all this land will be states, and they will all have people living there, significant numbers of people. But in their minds, this is nothing that has to be decided today. And so instead of getting everybody all amped up about it, we'll just say, hey, we'll decide in the future. Actually, we won't even decide. The people will decide. It's kind of washing their hands. Not my problem. That's a model of poor leadership. And that poor leadership will be detrimental to the country as we kind of roll forward here. So popular sovereignty, the Missouri Compromise failure really makes those issues unhappy. In fact, if you study the compromise and the result after the compromise, basically nobody's happy, which tells you a lot about where we're going. We're at the point now where that philosophical divide between the two sides is beginning to really start to deepen. So nobody's ever happy. When you're in a philosophical divide, like we are currently in our current day, you can never compromise. And when you can't, when you do try to compromise, everybody's unhappy. And that's what they were doing here. The Fugitive Slave Act will be the most explosive of the decisions, because it will actually be what brings the issue of what does slavery mean to individuals into the North. So let me show you that last little bit. We're going to kind of pick up the pace a smidgen to make sure we get where we need to get to today. So now let's kind of work our way through the different aspects of the road to the Civil War by looking at the aspects that are in the book that I wrote about. We can always see with every road to great crisis moment. So here they are. I've covered this with you before. I know it's small print, so we're gonna see this slide more than one time. So don't worry about trying to read the whole thing. They're not in a specific order, except as I've told you before, the idea that there's a war that leaves everybody unhappy is always the first thing, at least historically, has always been the first thing. For us, in our current story, because we're at the great crisis moment now, the Iraq War and the War on Terror is that moment. So war starts the conflict. Doesn't mean war starts the conflict of that war. War starts the road to the explosion. I probably should change that, but war starts things. But after that, it sort of just happens as we go. And what we've seen so far is we've seen the war, we've seen weak government leadership. In the period after Jackson, all the way up to Woodrow Wilson, so almost 80 years, we have about 15 presidents. In the previous, like 60 years up to Jackson, we had like 6 presidents. So you go through a period where there's lots of leaders, a lot of people leaving, you have people like William Henry Harris dying in office. You have poor governing decisions that get made by this weak governing leadership. There's also weak leadership because the old guard is getting to the end of their terms. So not that the young leaders can't do well, but in this case, they don't do well. Or maybe we might say the young leaders are so inflamed with their passions that they're not willing to do the compromise thing. And there's this growing sense amongst both the Southerners and the abolition people, as well as new immigrants, Irish in particular, that the government doesn't care about us at all. The government's not interested, they're not eager. And so there's this feeling of disenchantment with the government. See, historically, when a people, wherever they live, are at least satisfied, if not happy, then radical ideas are crazy. Oh, that's so radical. Nobody, and it's always the fringe, right, that talks about the crazy stuff. But when society begins to unravel and people feel like the current norm isn't working or the government's not paying attention, then what was previously radical becomes palpable. Like that, what we used to do is not working. Let's try something else. And that's where you can see historically, really bad decisions can get made by people, not just Americans. I mean, there's a lot of these examples throughout history. All right, so we're going to keep going now. We're going to start marking the rest of these off as we go. So the next one that happens, we're going to move chronologically, is Uncle Tom's Cabin. So a year and a half, really, after the Compromise of 1850. Everybody thought everything was fine. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes this explosive novel. It was considered by some a 1,000-pound bomb. And Lincoln, when he meets her after the war begins, he says, so you're the little lady that started this war. What she did is she wrote a novel, but it was based on firsthand accounts that she personally had investigated and heard from really former slaves who had escaped. And in her story centers around one woman and her child, and I think her name's Eliza Harris. And Harriet Beecher Stowe met the real life Eliza, it wasn't her real name obviously, in Ohio. And so the whole story is kind of centered around Ohio. It's actually centered around a city called Ripley, Ohio. You can go to Ripley today and you can see some of the Underground Railroad places where Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel really played out at some key moments. And what the book does is it touches the emotions of Northern people who largely didn't care about slavery, in many cases had never ever seen a Black person in their entire lives. So their sense of they should be worried about slavery or they should be mad about slavery, not even on the agenda. But now they start reading this book, which for a little while actually outsold the Bible, which the Bible, of course, even today is still one of the, if not the top selling book. That was pretty surprising. So this really brings to light that slavery is not a positive experience for the slave, which seems obvious on its face. But if you've never thought about it, right now there are over 40 million people enslaved in the world today. In fact, there are thousands and maybe even millions of slaves in this country. We like to cheapen it. We talk about it being like, sex slavery, or I just lost I can't think of the word I want to use that someone talk about. And I always go, no. Let's call it what it is. We should be offended that there's still slavery today in this region. Drive down OBT. It's a tragedy. But if I don't ever think about it, if I don't wonder who makes my clothes, there's slave labor making clothing and technology and pieces. If I don't stop and think about it, I just buy it from Amazon because it's the cheapest price, or we need to think about it. And Uncle Tom's Cabin made that moment really get in your face. Well, right after that comes another bad decision or interesting decision. It's really more of an unseen moment that eventually will be kind of a trigger. And that is, after we had won the land, as you, of course, know, gold is discovered in California. San Francisco 49ers, right? There's gold in their hills. And so Congress wanted to try to find a way to build a railroad across the West. They weren't sure what was out. In fact, they thought it was this huge desert, couldn't be profitable. What's the best route? And they sent the Army Corps of Engineers to get out there and start investigating. Well, they came back with 4 routes up here on the 47th, 49th parallel, 37th, 35th, 32nd. And they said, look, we have 4 routes. They actually also did what is basically Highway 1A. And of course, these become, as you know, let me go back though, these become our interstates. But Congress doesn't get what they want. What they really wanted was pick a spot. Army Corps of Engineers like, yeah, that's not our choice. We will say you can use them all. And as I just showed you with the interstate, we do use them all. Jefferson Davis, who is Secretary of War, and who kind of led the charge of let's get this done, thought the 32nd parallel route is the most obvious, because all of these other routes, where are they going to end up? They're going to end up in the Mississippi River. And then if it's going to be trade goods, what's going to happen? Well, a bunch of it's going to be on the Mississippi River and go south to New Orleans. So Jefferson Davis's point of view and Southern leaders' point of view was like, well, of course, let's just do the low route, crosses the least mountains, and it'll be easy. Go right to New Orleans, home run. But of course, for abolitionists, what does that mean? That's giving money to the South. It's giving money and support to slave power. Can't do that. So they opposed it. So kind of left in a little bit of a limbo as to what was going to happen. And again, all of these routes are useful. What's interesting is that they didn't actually survey the 42nd parallel. And if you know your history, that's exactly where they built the railroad. Now, just as an aside, I know we got to go. If you are interested in reading more about the railroad, you can never do wrong with reading Stephen Ambrose. And he's most known about writing on World War II. But this book, Nothing Like It in the World, is amazing. Most of his work is amazing. And so it's a good book to read about what happens with the railroad. It's not really a book about the Civil War, but it's about one of the great technological developments and accomplishments in our national history. So they will ultimately build them all, but they're going to have to figure out to build one. And this brings us back to our friend Stephen Douglas. Douglas realizes that as long as he's the senator from Illinois, if he can somehow get the railroad to come to Illinois, so to do that, it's going to need to come near Iowa, near modern to the top part of Missouri, then he reasons he can use his own connections to build railroads in Illinois. And what he was hypothesizing was if he could pull this off, then there was a real small little town that was on Lake Michigan that he thought would benefit and would maybe blow up really big. Small little place, you probably never heard of it, called Chicago. And his thought was the railroad coming across the center of the country would allow him to pull off this political move for his state. The thing about Douglas is not all that concerned about slavery one way or the other. I mean, it's like, yes, I care, but it's not my problem. So Douglas is going to work to put through a bill to organize the territory. Let me go back to this map, then we'll wrap it up. Let me go back to way back here for a second. You see how this map is it says unorganized territory? You probably remember from your study of the country that when we take over land, initially it's just unorganized territory and some huge big block, Louisiana Purchase territory. And then the step to statehood is over time, enough people move there and those people organize as a territory. They give it a name, it goes before Congress. Usually it's really big. You can see how big the Oregon territory is. You can see how big the Minnesota territory. You know there's going to be more states pulled out of those territories. And then when more people move into at least a piece of that territory, those people can appeal to become a state. This all goes back to the rules Jefferson worked out with the old Northwest Territory, which is this part, Ohio to Wisconsin, that circle there. So what Douglas wants to be able to do is to be able to have the government use its power of land, particularly right here, but also here, to be able to give land as a kind of an incentive to businesses who could build the railroad. But you can't do that here unless it's organized. And so what Douglas proposed was to make this one big territory called Nebraska. And this idea of creating a thing called Nebraska will blow up in his face so that, as you can see, in January of '54, he backtracks to say, hey, I got a better idea. Instead of one territory, we'll have two. One will be called Nebraska, like it planned, and the other will be called Kansas. And it'll be right beside Missouri. So, hint, 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 probably more people will move to Kansas from Missouri or the South with their slaves, and other people will move to Nebraska without slaves. So it'll be kind of even Steven, one slave state, one non-slave state, which maybe in 1830 would have been great. But in 1854, it's going to blow up in his face. And next week, we'll start right there, and I'll show you that the first shots of the Civil War actually were not fired at Fort Sumter, but they were fired in Kansas. We'll kind of talk our way through that. It is so good to see all of you there in Stover and everybody else on the line who's been with us, some of you the whole time. I appreciate you being here, and we will be back next week. and we'll pick it up right from there. If you have questions, emailing me is probably the best. You guys there in Stover, you can give a question to Becca, or she'll give you my email. You can email me at the college. Everybody else also can do the same thing. Thank you so much for coming and spending time with us, and I hope you stay safe, and we will talk to you soon. All right, bye-bye.